I'd be happy to answer any questions.
You mentioned all the things it doesn't include, like STRS and whatnot. Would you also include that retiree health care? That's a pretty good sized nut as well, isn't it?
That's a pretty good one too, and we don't because there's no specific statutory obligation
These are all,
to retire that.
All the things you mentioned are big ticket items.
They're pretty big tickets, especially CalSTRS is by far the potentially largest.
I think they want something like $3.5 billion a year or something like that. It would seem then that if you just even grab a few of those STRS, maybe retiree health care, you could wipe out that pretty quickly, couldn't you?
Yes.
And you also assume no COLAs. Is that a I know there's nothing in statute requiring COLAs, but there's going to be obviously a lot of pressure to actually have COLAs in these programs.
Actually, it actually has specific language that says we shall not have automatic COLAs.
No, they're not automatic, but there's going to be, no doubt, a great deal of pressure from the stakeholders to budget for COLA.
Absolutely. It's been several years since we've had general inflationary increases or across-the-board COLAs for our state employees. And so the notion that we would go 5 more years is probably not a safe assumption, but it's one that we did because that's kind of current law.
Matt, could you talk about briefly, the campaign that just ended for Prop 30 was largely about schools, but the governor also talked about the budget, we talked about the state's finances. There probably were a number of voters who went to the polls with the trigger cuts in mind and other things that we are stabilizing the state's finances. The message out of your report is Prop 30 doesn't fix all of that. That's one message to take away, at least in the short term of the next 18 months. It doesn't fix everything.
Well, Prop 30 clearly had 2 purposes. It had general fund revenues that meant that the Prop 98 guarantee would be higher than it otherwise would be, but that the general fund would also receive some of the benefit for the revenues that didn't go from a higher 98 guarantee. So it was to stabilize school funding and to help address the budget's problem. If you look at these numbers, it certainly has helped significantly. I think all we're pointing out is that because of this backlog of terrible budgets that we've faced and many actions that we've taken that have deferred expenses, we still have a lot of catching up to do. And to Dan's question is, yes, you could easily spend this money to address some of paying off those budgetary obligations. We haven't talked about mandate obligations and problems that have existed far beyond our current budget problems, like CalSTRS or retiree health. They've always been on pay-as-you-go. It's just that those are things that we really should try to address to some degree in the near future.
How much did you lose via the Facebook IPO?
It came down by about $626 million from the assumption that was in the Budget Act, which was $1.9 billion. 1.2-ish.
So when you look at Prop 30, how much of the improvement in the state's financial situation is directly attributable to Prop 30 passing? And also, it sounds like what you're saying is that Prop 30 kind of provides an opportunity to look at some of the other things that have been building up for a while.
Well, it puts you in a much better situation again. If you look at the chart, you're now facing operating surpluses in the near term. So again, I think it's hard to give you a precise answer. In general, it was probably roughly half and half, but depending on what assumptions you make, the numbers could vary. But we're in that kind of maintenance factor payoff, or roughly on average, it's probably half and half.
Mm-hmm. Do you think sorry, just one last thing. Do you think this is an opportunity for the state to start addressing some of the problems that have built up over the years, like some of the problems that you've mentioned here?
Well, it certainly is a chance for us to resolve many of those problems. And again, let me separate out. Within Prop 98, we go with the minimum guarantee that would occur given our revenues. And so when you look at our estimates for Prop 98, it is growing each year. Okay, there's extra money each year, $2 to $3 billion of new money for 98. There's also money in there because we spent $2.2 billion in the current year to pay off one-time obligations. It's available for either more one-time obligations or to spend it on ongoing things. So there's going to be money to restore cuts that we've made in recent years, to pay off deferrals, to pay off mandates, to address a lot of the one-time problems within 98. I think the tougher situation is the non-98 side. Whereas we talked about, certainly in the near term, you don't have the additional monies to address whether it's CalSTRS or non-education mandates or retiree health care, because you're going to be struggling just to kind of maintain the programs that you currently are at. Obviously, there's pressures given cuts we've made in those programs to restore some of those, and the legislature is going to be constrained in the next couple of years about how much it can do without other actions.
Let me ask you
How much of
a
a
question.
firewall would there be between the 98 and non-98 side? I mean, we saw in his trigger cuts he had laid out a roadmap for how you could tap some of that 98 money. I mean, with the moving the general obligation bond debt into 98.
Those are always available, Kevin. That'd be up to the legislature. They obviously have to balance their 98 with their others. So it could come to some point where if 98's doing so well, it's hard to say that after the cuts we made recently. But if all the money, I don't know, maybe they would consider something like that.
Let me ask you a kind of a technical question. You combine in this thing, for comparison purposes, the general fund and this new
Yes,
thing that's been
EPA.
set up, the
Educational Protection Account.
as not to be confused with the ERAF or all the other acronyms we use.
That's
around.
right.
Where does the realignment money come in? Do you include that in that comparison? So
The realignment money is now with the locals.
So they're taking about a penny and a quarter of sales tax, $5 billion, give or take.
Yes.
Okay.
That's no longer in the state's
That's no longer
general fund revenue.
So, but it's money that's being spent essentially in lieu of general fund money for all intents and purposes.
Well, we shifted responsibilities and
Yeah.
money down to the locals.
Yet your longer-term projection on corrections appears to be flat, even though we're giving all this money to the locals to take away these.
Well, we already shifted a lot of the cost, Dan, and then we show some additional reductions as the rest of the realignment is shifted down to them. But after, Brian helped me out, 2 or 3 years, you've essentially done the shift. The people have rolled over. You have in the base of the locals what's going to be in the base. And that's why our correction populations tend to flatten off by the end of the
And
period.
it shows a basically flat level of about $8 billion a year for that segment of the budget. I mean, that's not an awful lot less than we've been paying for corrections in the past, is it? It's
No, it's down.
$1 billion
I don't know,
less or something?
Oh, yeah, it's over $1 billion. I mean, then you have to what it would have been, given our medical cost and pressures. It's, I don't know, Brian, at least $1 billion, $1.5 billion. Yeah.
So, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay, so on page 3 here, we're talking about changes in accounting practices.
Yes.
There's $1.4 billion that came from the 11-12 fiscal year.
Yeah.
Is that from Prop 30 revenue? That increase from?
Well, Jason, you have to help me. It's
That's
somewhat
under,
related.
That's
but-
under existing accrual methods prior to Prop 30. That was 2010-11. The point we make in the box is that with Prop 30, accrual methods have changed, and these prior year accrual adjustments, which have always been occurring, are much more likely to be bigger than this in the future, and that is a concern.
So the accrual method changed in Prop 30. The Prop 30 changed the accrual
Right,
method.
that's not what the 1.4 billion is. That's 10-11 money, but what we're talking about in that box is about future accruals and how they could become a much bigger issue for budget planning.
So the $1.4 billion, the positive fund balance adjustment, is for the general fund
Yeah.
that came out of the 10-11 fiscal year.
That's
So this is pretty old.
right, but accounting reconciliations take many months, in some cases years.
When did they tell you about this?
About a week ago.
And they just discovered it in the past week?
You'll have to talk to the
You'd
administration.
have to ask them.
And do you know where the money came from? Why there, where the estimates were off before?
It would have had to do with personal and corporate income taxes in 10-11.
Has this happened before, or they just?
There's always accruals.
Always accrual adjustments.
This is larger than usual, I think it's fair to say.
You say in here that you think this is this kind of method is perhaps a bad way to go, given the.
Well, that 1.4 billion is under the prior method. What we're talking about in the box, for the most part, is how the new method could make this sort of issue potentially much bigger and much more common going forward.
Okay. So this 1.4 billion, this is money that has not been earmarked in the budget. This is more money that can be spent.
Yeah, it reduces the budget problem.
Reduces the budget problem.
Yes.
Okay. Why was the administration's estimate on redevelopment so much different than your expectations on redevelopment?
Well, look, we dissolved redevelopment pretty quickly. And there was just a lot of stuff we didn't know about their debts, their obligations, and so there clearly was a lot of uncertainty surrounding how much money we would get, both in the annual increment that would flow through to districts, plus on a one-time basis, what was truly unencumbered that the state could capture. So it's not surprising that there was a lot of uncertainty. And Marianne, please chime in if there's something I'm missing here. But we maybe, based on our talking with folks in the county land and looking at the numbers, we always suspected that it was going to be much tougher, especially in the short run, with legal issues, with questions, to get as much. And so we've been raising concerns for quite a while. Now, they could still get this money. Maybe they'll get it and it'll come in later. And so the out years will look a little better than what we're assuming. But we've been pretty much around that number now for quite a while.
And the reason why your estimate is much lower is because of that the money isn't there, or that the money is earmarked for other debt obligations, something like that.
Well, in the case of the increment, it's because there are probably more debts that need to be paid off before the increment flows through.
Mm-hmm.
It may be that the administration and my office is closer together on the increment. Probably more dispute about the cash assets. Is that fair to say, Marianne?
Yes.
It's Marianne O'Malley who has followed this issue.
And when you say the cash assets, what do you mean?
There are redevelopment agencies have two pots. There's a housing fund and there are capital projects fund. And there's a question about how much of those funds need to be maintained in their accounts in order to pay off existing obligations, and how much of it could be redirected to cities, counties, special districts, and schools.
Mary, let me ask you a question. Local governments have been complaining that the legislature's been acting like a bunch of stormtroopers coming in and screaming, stealing their money, and just basically being a-holes about it, the whole thing. And yet, it doesn't seem to have resulted in a lot more money. What happened? I mean, they claim they're being treated like inmates in prisons or something like that. I'm sure you've heard the same complaints.
I mean, it's very hard for cities. They were planning to have these redevelopment agencies, and now the law of the land is we're dissolving them and trying to quickly, expeditiously wind down their financial.
But if the Department of Finance is being so tough on these requests for retaining money, and have been so adamant about grabbing as much money as they can, which is apparently their attitude, why hasn't it generated more money then? More than as much money as they thought it would generate. I mean, if they're taking this tough attitude, why isn't it working?
Certainly, the Department of Finance has invalidated some of the requests that cities and county redevelopment agencies have put forth. With the last official ROPS, the Recognized Obligation Payment Schedule, the Department of Finance generally insisted that the agencies transfer about 15 to 20% more money than the local agencies had initially proposed.
Do you anticipate that this is just a delay in collections, or is this a permanent thing that they're never going to see the kind of money that they
Longer term, we're going to see significant response from the agencies.
So it might work out in the long run for
It
them.
will work out.
Okay.
Matt, could you, a couple of things quickly. One of them is the federal fiscal cliff debate. Could you talk in as much specificity as you can about what the impact of that would be to California? Were that not to have a good outcome? What would it mean for our budget?
Well, it's mainly on the economy and revenues, not so much directly on the budget. Because a lot of the sequestration was on programs that, some of our bigger programs are exempt from the sequestration, like Medi-Cal and large sums of money. So to the extent that we lost federal funds, it would be non-matching monies. So we weren't seeing a huge effect directly on the budget. We were much more concerned about what it meant for the economy. We have an example in here. If we did go into a recession, and Jason helped me, but I think over 2 years it was a loss of $11 billion. If we had a downturn and a recession in 2013, $11 billion over a 2-year period. That's where all the money and the concern is, of what a fiscal cliff would do to the national economy, which would do to our economy, and its impact on revenues, as opposed to on the expenditure side.
And then I had a question about the the operating surpluses that you all are projecting.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think this came up a moment ago. We don't really have an exact number about what the Prop 30 impact of those surpluses were versus their Prop 30 didn't exist, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you said it's hard to tease it out to say how much of this is attributable to Prop 30.
Again, I give you a rough kind of rule of all, but depending on where you put the revenues in, it could make slight differences.
But suffice it to say that the Prop 30 revenue buys the state some breathing room under your forecast to deal with some other issues.
Well, it does two things, remember. It's money for schools that they wouldn't have had, and it helps the budget in making those numbers look better than they otherwise would have.
But what I'm saying is it allows you, as you were saying, you could do some things with these surpluses. You could put it in a 58 account. You could deal with some of the unfunded liabilities in pension. I mean, you could.
They have total control over how they would spend those things.
It buys them some breathing room, I guess was my point. I'm not trying to put that phrase in your mouth, but absent that money, there wouldn't be as many options.
Well, again, I think buying breathing room suggests that you would be in a deficit situation absent them. You probably were still going to be okay because of other actions we've taken, a slightly improved economy, but it certainly gives you more room to play with. And again, next year we'll have what that next year looks like when the revenues trigger off, and that'll give us a better indication of, well, how careful do we have to be once we get another year out? How many commitments can we make? And then there's, of course, the trade-off of the one-time resolving some of these issues versus selectively restoring certain cuts. That's going to be their tough decisions because I'm sure they're going to have lots of pressure to restore some of those cuts.
Well, what's your suggestion to them?
Well, again, we said high priority on building up your reserve. And again, they may not have a choice of that if the governor decides not to suspend the transfer. Those would automatically happen. So just take $3 billion off the top for 2 or 3 years. But we think that's wise. We could slow down or turn down in the future at any time. And we don't want to be in the same situation we were in the past 10 to 15 years when we had a downturn and we weren't really prepared for it because we didn't have a reserve.
Right, and at the risk of beating the horse a tad too much here, although
he's not kicking, John.
Somewhere. The accrual issue that we've been talking about, and when you all learned about this from finance, had you been asking for it for a while, that data, and all of a sudden just got it, or was it just like knock on the door, hey, here's something we didn't give you? Trying to understand the dynamic.
No, we hadn't been asking for it before because it's much bigger than we typically would expect to see.
What is
put that in context for me, Jason.
Typically, we have hundreds of millions in terms of fund balance adjustments, if I recall correctly, plus or minus. And this is just one. There'll be other fund balance adjustments potentially as they complete the process of reconciling data with the controller, which happens every year.
At this time of year?
The general fund.
Yeah, I mean, we could get them now.
I think we're all a little. Go ahead.
When you say a week ago, was it after Tuesday or Tuesday, Wednesday?
I don't remember exactly.
Midnight.
Actually, on top of my head, but I don't
Wednesday, 9 a.m.
Yeah, I think we're all there's some skepticism here, and we're all trying to see if there's any reason for that skepticism, or if you guys think that everything's pretty normal with this.
Not sure we know enough.
I think we understand what the issues are. Accruals are very complex, and they are very difficult to sort of manage in the models that we use for forecasting taxes. And so, is it completely understandable that mistakes would happen in those complex calculations? I think yes. I think that the point we're trying to make in the report is that going forward, we're on a path to make these calculations even more complicated. And that's something that we question, in part because of these challenges in knowing what the prior numbers were.
Try to bring it a little bit, just quickly for me, to a bit of a pseudo-real-world understanding of it. Rather than the processes and the long-term implications, what does it mean about the state's budgetary bottom line issues that we would have thought before you had that information and now what we have after? What does it mean?
That $1.9 billion deficit would have been larger.
By a magnitude of 1.4?
Exactly.
So it would have been, instead of almost 2, it would have been almost 3.5.
Yes.
And you expected some kind of change.
Yeah,
it's not unusual to expect some kind of change.
There's always accrual adjustments. They can be positive or negative. They can be on revenues and expenditures. And this was just larger than normal. And whether it's related to Prop 30 or just a change in our accruals, again, I think you'd have to talk with the administration.
This isn't related to Prop 30.
I'm sorry.
This is 1011. This is passed.
Mac, could I maybe ask the same question a different way?
Sure.
If Prop 30 had failed, what kind of a deficit would we be looking at?
$10 billion.
That's
Do you have your alternate forecast?
I think you need both.
I think what makes that hard to answer, Judy, is that we have other issues that could come into play, because then you have the realignment issue. right, on how those revenues were treated, because Proposition 30 resolved that constitutionally by saying they would not be counted. If it had been defeated, we're back into, is it the court case that says you don't have to count them? We have other statutory language. And I think it's really hard for us to then say exactly what would have been the case. I think we would have had to wait to see how some of those issues played out.
And a little bit of step back on, you noted in the beginning that, this is the first time in like a decade that the fiscal outlook looks decent. And I wonder if you could put it in context for California residents, like, wow, is this high, should they feel better, more positive?
Well, yeah, no, definitely. I think definitely so. We've stabilized our problem, even in the near term, even though we have a small problem. Relatively speaking, it's not much compared to what we've been facing. And you have much more positive outlook in the future. So what that means is you don't, at least for people who rely on state spending, like schools or university students or health and social service recipients, they're not going to have to worry about additional program reductions. Or certainly, if there may be some small adjustments made, but nothing like we've had to look out in past years. And so I think going forward, it's more a question of there will be pressures to restore some of those reductions that we've taken. And we've just said, well, legislature, you should probably be careful in selectively restoring them because you do face all of these other pressures that we went over. But definitely, this is a much, much more positive situation than we've faced in many, many years. And it's on the whole, pretty good news.
1.9 billion sounds like a big number.
Not when you were looking at 12 and 15 and $20 billion operating deficits.
But given all the cuts that have happened over the last 2 years, and then to now have to cut another 1.9.
Well, but again, let's be careful. This is our estimate of what we think they would face.
Right.
And for example, if the administration still feels like they can get the redevelopment monies, they have a different assumption than we do, because there is a lot of uncertainty around it. They might have a much smaller definition of the problem. Let me give you another example. The budget counts on $500 million in auction revenues from our cap and trade that can offset general fund spending. We assume that only $100 million could be used to offset general fund spending because that's all we could identify. And we haven't been informed of other expenditures that those revenues could be used to offset general fund costs. If the administration comes up with those, they would have a problem that's $400 million less than ours. So when we get to January, you could have the governors have a much smaller problem than we do just because they've made other assumptions and people can reasonably differ about it.
Would you briefly explain why you all don't believe the cap and trade auction money, that much of it can be used to be counted towards general fund? What's the general explanation?
We looked for areas where there was a link to the program, sort of a resources link where we were spending money, and we could only find about $100 million. And so, again, if the administration can come forward with other spending that we think falls within the sort of purview of what that fee was levied for, we're happy to look at that.
If that's accurate with that $100 million, if that turns out to be the case, what happens to the other $400 million? Do they got to find some new program to spend it on, or where does that money go?
Good question. I guess they could spend it on other resources programs.
Create new program, new resources program?
Yes, that is directed towards meeting the goals of the cap and trade program. It's just that the question is, can they be used to offset existing general fund spending? So I'm sure they could find a way to spend the money. Our question on cap and trade related matters. The question is how much can be used to offset general fund spending.
And what was the $100 million? What was included in that?
Oh, there were some things in I think CAL FIRE.
You see at University of California, CAL FIRE related, some water related stuff.
What about high-speed rail? Could you use any of that money to pay down high-speed rail bond service?
We thought there were real serious problems with doing so. Again, someone may be able to make that case. The problem is high-speed rail in the early years actually increases our carbon footprint.
And the reason for this, Mac, is that you have to find a nexus back to these kind of climate change issues.
That was our view, but again, there's even uncertainty about those kind of legal issues.
On that subject, I know your office has opined that the cap and trade is doable without the carton, without the auction, but have you looked at the legality of the auction? Is it a tax or not a tax? Have you guys studied that?
Well, we've certainly considered it and thought about it. It's kind of a tough call, and obviously we're not lawyers, so we haven't opined about anything. That's not what we do, but it's kind of an awkward one. It's not your typical fee when you're raising billions of dollars that could then be used for more general purpose things, like a high-speed rail or other things. But it's not quite a tax. You're selling, in effect, almost like selling rights to pollute a certain amount. It can be viewed as maybe a franchise fee, like a cable. So it's a little awkward. It's very different from what we normally run across, and it's really not clear to us how it would be treated.
Could the legislature take a step back on it, though, and re-envision this in some way, do a 2/3 vote, and then use that money for general fund?
Potentially. Now, if it did take a new vote on it as something different, it would be subject to Proposition 26.
Oh, okay.
But again, if they have a 2/3 vote, they could pass it as a tax and do whatever they wanted.
But you're of the view that as it currently stands, the auction revenues are not subject to 26.
Right. They were authorized before 26.
In the AB 32 and 1493 language.
Yes.
On another topic, you say in here that you think the transition of healthy families into Medi-Cal is going to be slower than projected. Has the administration said that they're going to slow that down, or where does that come from?
Mark, I don't.
Yes, they have publicly at hearings released a slower transition plan relative to what the budget assumed. So the savings will be lower in the budget year.
Does that mean they're not going to start January 1st, or how are they slowing that down?
Just starting January 1st, but phasing in the whole population, which is almost 900,000, just over a longer period of time, but still starting January 2013.
And real quick, I know you're not, but the idea of a possible supermajority in both houses, there's been talk of whether it's tax reform or tax exemptions. What would your message be to lawmakers interested in exploring that option?
I think that would be very productive to go down that road. Anything that we could do that reduces our volatility of our system, I think would be a good thing. We've always sort of encouraged them to consider low rates and broad bases. Those are tough tasks to do, but I think it's well worth their efforts in the future.
Any impact you can tell of Prop 39?
Sure. Prop 39 increased revenues by just under $450 million in the current year, and it will increase revenues by about $1 billion in the out years, and we've included that in the forecast. Now, in the next 5 years, starting in 13-14, a half of that will go to resource-specific programs, and the state would benefit from the remainder. So we've built that all then in.
Half of the 4 to 500.
No, I'm sorry. There's a half-year effect in 12-13.
Okay, that's
there's
right.
$1 billion effect,
Yeah.
and for the 5 following years, half of that would be general fund, just general fund revenues. The other half would be, in effect, special fund revenues dedicated for that particular purpose.
Mac, did you look at the possible effects of Proposition 30's tax increase on the wealthy? What would happen if President Obama's plan to tax the wealthy, whether that kicks back in, how that would affect the economy of California? Did you look at that in any of your numbers?
Well, not specifically. I mean, I think in our economic U.S. economic forecast, in the future we would take into account whatever deal was done. There would be some macroeconomic effects. But I think the Prop 30 tax rate increases, that's more a California-specific issue of how our rates are relative to other states and whether we think, there's a much of effect on behavior of those higher tax rates.
So do you see any potential for a double whammy causing more trouble for California economically if the wealthy?
I think the issue is more of a national one, what those might do to the economy. I think what we would be concerned about is, but it's really hard to know, is what are the effect of our higher personal income tax rates on high income people. We don't have a specific adjustments in our forecast. We know there will be some behavioral effects. People, rearranging their tax lives or businesses, changing some decisions, but the evidence to date suggests it's not a huge effect, or it's certainly not a huge effect in the short run So we haven't built in anything specific, but you're certainly concerned that there will be some effect.
Was there any Prop 98 effect from that accrual, that 1.4 billion popping up? Does that change anything?
Not in and of itself, because it's treated as just an adjustment to our carrying balance. So the only effect would have been how it might have otherwise been treated in some future year if it's pushed back. But again, I'd say probably generally no, there was no 98 effect. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks.